remember very soon after the pandemic and the lockdowns were announced that the state of California brought in draconian rules, including a prohibition on singing out loud in churches. Well, singing as a form of prayer has been since before recorded time. And this, of course, was a violation of the First Amendment. This very quickly made its way to the U.S. Supreme Court, and it was a wonderful ruling. I haven't looked at it in a couple of years, but it was written so poetically, in which the Supreme Court of the United States said that the state of California was welcome to regulate singing. It absolutely could, but they couldn't regulate the singing in churches more harshly than they regulated the singing in American Idol in Hollywood. And so they struck down the rules because they had exemptions for the favored classes. They did everywhere around the world. And even if they didn't, well, the fancy people simply didn't follow the laws themselves. Laws were for the little people, don't you know? But what I take away from that is this. The U.S. Supreme Court realized that it was a bonfire of American civil liberties and nothing less than the First Amendment itself was at stake. And so very quickly, I would say it was within months, they ruled and struck down that law and others as well. There was a famous case in California. I believe there was another one from Massachusetts. It's been a little while since I read them. And I say all this because it is now almost 2025, and we have been in this state of pandemic or post-pandemic for 4.5 years now. And if I'm not mistaken, and our next guest will correct me if I am, our Supreme Court has been too busy to take a single substantive case emanating from the lockdowns. It's been 4.5 years. I say again, this dramatic case that dealt with violations of civil liberties was heard by the U.S. Supreme Court in very short order, within months, I'd tell you. And here we are coming up on the 5-year anniversary of the declaration of the pandemic. And I don't think our court has bothered with anything as trifling as the curfew in Quebec, as the mandatory vaccinations or you'd lose your job, or 100 other outrages. And so it brings me to the troubling headline I see before me today. Supreme Court of Canada declines to hear COVID vaccine travel mandate cases. And those are cases in which the plaintiffs included Brian Peckford, the former Premier of Newfoundland and Labrador. In fact, the last surviving signer of the Constitution and Charter of Rights of 1982, and another case with Maxime Bernier as a plaintiff. And the reason they say is that, well, the pandemic's over, so it's moot anyways. There's no point in even hearing it. Our Supreme Court is so busy, you see, dealing with very important things, and lockdowns and pandemics just don't make the list. Joining us now to talk about this is the lawyer for the Justice Center of Constitutional Freedoms, Allison Pejovic, who joins us from Calgary. Allison, nice to meet you. Thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you so much for having me today.
Am I correct in saying that the Supreme Court of Canada has yet to hear a civil liberties case emerging from every level of government, regulating to its heart's content during the lockdowns? And please correct me if I'm wrong, but I really don't think they've ever actually touched on a single lockdown case. Am I wrong?
That was the case up until this year when they announced that they have agreed to hear a case out of Newfoundland called Taylor versus Newfoundland. It involved a case of a woman who wanted to travel to Newfoundland from out of province to visit her ailing mother. And there was in Newfoundland a travel restriction that prohibited any out of province residents of other provinces from entering Newfoundland during that time. And she took that case to the Newfoundland court, and she raised Section 6 of the Charter, which is the mobility right. And the court found that the mobility right was infringed, but that the infringement was justifiable based on the circumstances. You know, it's COVID, and government was just doing what it needed to do. And the case went to the Newfoundland Court of Appeal. The Newfoundland Court of Appeal dismissed it for mootness because it found, the travel restriction is gone. the Supreme Court of Canada has agreed to hear that case. It's unclear to me as to whether that the Supreme Court of Canada's judgment will, if the applicant is successful, whether the case will go back down to the Newfoundland Court of Appeal to be heard on the merits there, or if the Supreme Court will adjudicate the charter issue at the highest level. So they have agreed to hear this very narrow issue. But I will say, in contrast to our case, I mean, I'm sure that case was beautifully presented to the court, but we've got a mobility case on such a greater level where Canadian citizens couldn't get on airplanes to leave the country, basically locking Canadians in the country unless you wanted to swim across the Atlantic, which government witnesses admitted was permissible in cross-examination. So it's really, really distressing to our clients and to Canadians as a whole, vaccinated or unvaccinated, because now Canadians just don't know whether they're living in the kind of country where this is lawful behavior from the federal government.
Well, first of all, thank you for telling me about that case. I was unfamiliar with it. And that does sound like it was an atrocious violation of our Constitution. I've never before heard, I mean, when foreign nationals come to our country illegally, cross Roxham Road, their very first act on Canadian soil is an act of law breaking. They are not required to stay in one province or another. They have mobility rights. And when Canadian citizens are not allowed to travel across provinces because of a COVID scare, that's an atrocious violation. But what I don't understand, so you're saying this will be heard by the Supreme Court, whether they decide to send it back or hear it in full. You're saying they have accepted this case and it'll be heard in 2025. Is that what you're saying?
I don't know when that case will be heard. I'm not sure of the date, but certainly it ought to be later this year or in 2025. Yeah,
I don't think it, I mean, the Supreme Court moves as slowly as a glacier. At the very least, late 2024, if not 2025. So 5 years after the lockdowns begin, our Supreme Court has decided to take a look at a case. So I can no longer say they haven't bothered with a single case. Now I have to say they do with one case. But as you point out, although this was a violation of this woman's rights, it was one person. Whereas it wasn't just airplanes. If I recall, it was trains and it was ferries and it was ships. And it wasn't just to leave the country. It was to get around within the country. You couldn't fly within your own country. There was no science behind it. I know that the Justice Center examined in great detail different decision makers in the government, and they admitted that there was no science behind it. They admitted that this was not actually an act of public health based on science. How can you say, if you're the Supreme Court, we're going to hear this case of this poor woman in Newfoundland? That's not moot, or at least they're going to rule on that. But a massive travel ban that affected tens of millions of people, that paralyzed the whole country, that's moot. We don't need to ask any questions about it because it's over now. How do you square the circle?
It's very difficult to understand. And I can tell you, it didn't get a lot of media attention, but one of our clients, as you mentioned, was the former Premier of Newfoundland, Brian Peckford. He actually had a hand in drafting the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And when he comes to the court and says, I drafted the charter myself, and I'm telling you that I believe a plethora of my rights have been violated. I'm asking you to hear my case. And he can't get his day in court. That's very troubling to Mr. Peckford and should be for all Canadians. We also have the unique circumstances of Maxime, who is the leader of the PPC Party of Canada. And specifically, in his circumstances, he's trying to build his political party, and Canada's a large country. It's very difficult for him to drive from city to city, town to town across the country, meeting people and growing his party. He needs to get on an airplane to do that, to be competitive with his political opponents. And here you have one of his political opponents basically instituting a policy which prevents him from fairly participating in the democratic process and getting a fair shot at becoming elected. And that is novel. We've never seen this before. And when the federal court below said, well, there are no novel issues in this case. This case is not important enough. It's not evasive of review. We've had other COVID cases, so we don't need to hear this. Actually, no, this is extremely novel for Maxime Bernier and anyone else who wants to follow in his footsteps and try to campaign across the country. If they can't do that, that is unfair and it's certainly undemocratic.
You know, I can't believe that such an atrocious, draconian, bullying, tyrannical, unscientific, prejudicial, partisan, and generally unfair law can be implemented on people. And just because, I mean, how long was it in effect, the no-fly zone for unjabbed people? Was it a year?
It was in effect, no, not quite a year, but I know for the people that it affected, it felt like a year. It was the end of November of 2021. I think the first 2 weeks you could still get through with a negative PCR test. But then at the end of November, or the first couple of weeks of December, you had to show proof of vaccination. And then the Prime Minister decided to lift the mandate in June of 2022. And ironically, that was immediately after some of the evidence came out that you referenced, which was that the COVID recovery team at Transport Canada admitted in cross-examination that she'd never received word or memo or request or anything from the Public Health Agency of Canada, which gave a health reason, a medical reason to implement the travel mandate. Shortly after that evidence came out, the federal government lifted the travel ban for unvaccinated people. So, it was a long time coming for people who were trying to see dying loved ones. And some of our clients had very sick loved ones in South Africa and in Europe, and they were unable to go and visit them. I mean, this was basically like something you would hear about in a country far away with what you'd think of as a far more totalitarian head of government than we think of as having in Canada.
You know, the word lockdown heretofore had been used to describe prisons when there was a riot and everyone was confined in their cells. I don't really remember the use of the word lockdown on innocent citizens ever in history. And so if you're saying this is from November 2021 to June 2022, that's about 7 months. I've got to think that was millions of people who would have flown, taken a train, or at least hundreds of thousands, and for a very long time. And they didn't know when it would end, by the way. And there's certain things you can only do once: attend a funeral, attend a wedding, attend a surgery.
Yeah, and hold the hand of your dying loved one, right?
Yeah. And for the court to say, well, it's no longer in effect now, so we don't need to tell you if it was unconstitutional or not. Basically, that sends a message to the government that the courts are so slow. Like I say, that U.S. Supreme Court moved wicked fast. I'd have to look it up. The case about praying in California, that was within months. It wasn't years. The Supreme Court got straight to it. But what Canada's lethargic Supreme Court is teaching is, hey, governments, be as abusive as you like. Come up with new and exotic ways to punish people, not based on science, but based on politics. And we'll move so damn slow that you can have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 months of the most bizarre and arcane rules. And then as long as you stop it before the lawsuit begins, you're fine. You're good as gold, because we're not going to get into a fuss about what tyranny you did a few months ago. That's moot now. I promise you this, the government learned their lesson, which is they can do it. They can get away with it, and they'll do it again. I find this atrocious.
Absolutely. And what's interesting about our case, I mean, the points you make are perfectly valid, but in our case, you may not be aware, but we filed our application at the lower court in February of 2022, and we had 5 expert witnesses on our side. We were partnered with another set of applicants who had 4 experts. The government came back with numerous experts, and they were all cross-examined in a short time period in May and June 2022, and we had a court date of October. So we were able to get filed and before the court for that charter hearing in less than a year. So we all moved very quickly. The Crown moved very quickly, and we worked well together, and we were still unable to get this case heard. And so you're quite right. It does send a message to Canadians You can dislike the public health orders all you want, but you may never get to challenge them in court. And what I find really interesting is when the Freedom Convoy was going, and if you recall, and I know that you will, the Freedom Convoy, part of the reason why the truckers and lots of Canadian citizens went to Ottawa to protest was to protest, various mandates, but certainly the travel ones were high on the list. Mm-hmm. And they were told by, the media or whoever else, this isn't the appropriate forum for you to be protesting. You should exercise your rights through the court system. Have the judges adjudicate. That's the way to challenge what you feel is unjust. Well, this is what happens. Yeah. You get these orders that are put in and removed before Canadians can get to the court system. Yeah. And then when you get there, the judges do have discretion to hear these cases anyway, but they're deciding not to. And so where are Canadians left? They file these court challenges that don't go anywhere, or they peacefully protest and get their bank accounts frozen. So, what are we left with here in Canada?
What a great point. You're not allowed to protest in Parliament Hill, even though it was the largest peaceful protest in Canadian history. You're not allowed to go to court. Well, you can, but you'll just burn up your money because at the last minute they'll say, oh, sorry, it's moot. The 5 political parties that were in the leaders' debate in 2021 were unanimous on all the key issues because they included the Green Party, but did not include the aforementioned Maxime Bernier of the People's Party, even though he was at the same point in the polls as the Green Party. So you're not allowed to join politics. You're not allowed to go to the law. You're not allowed to have a political protest. And of course, social media companies would censor you for disinformation if you disputed health measures. What a stitch up, as the British would say. But it's not that surprising that the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court himself issued a statement that he was going to enforce vaccines on the court precincts itself. So just in case any lower judge was wondering what the Supreme Court's position was on the lockdowns and the pandemic, the Chief Justice himself pretty much winked and said, guys, let me put it this way. I'm enforcing a vaccine mandate at the Supreme Court building, so govern yourself accordingly. We don't need to have the fuss and the muss of actually have a hearing. You just know what to do. I find this very demoralizing, which is yet another reason why I thought the truckers were so important and so effective. And by the way, I credit the truckers for defenestrating Erin O'Toole as conservative leaders. So perhaps the truckers helped fix our political system too. Last word to you, Allison. Thank you for your work on this. I guess this is a closed door then. There's just nowhere else to go if the Supreme Court declines to hear it. Am I right?
Yeah, there's nowhere else to go for us in this case. But, it's a real travesty of justice, being the lawyer working on the file, getting to know the clients very well, and hearing the evidence that came out, win or lose. And of course, if we'd gone through the hearing and lost and gone through the appeal process and lost, that's one thing. And, as lawyers, we win some and we lose some. But having the kind of evidence come out that came out during those cross-examinations on such an important issue, not having that evidence properly adjudicated and going through the appropriate charter test with it is, I can't tell you that what a tragedy that is for Canadian justice. Honestly, some of the information that we received that came out, most people will never hear about it. I know we've done some news releases, but it's really going to get lost, and the public deserves to know loud and clear that there was no medical health reason, at least testified to, admitted to by the government in cross-examination, to put these draconian mandates in place. What would the court have done with that information? Canadians deserve to know, and they deserve to know the kind of country they live in. And if they cannot count on being able to leave when they want to leave, then they have to make decisions as to whether they want to join their family in other countries. So these are really critical issues, and it's so disappointing as an understatement, to say the least. Wow, very powerful. So glad to meet you, Allison Pejovic, lawyer who was working on the file on behalf of the Justice Center. Great to meet you, and
share your views on these things, but I'm glad you fought the fight.
Thanks so much, Ezra. It's very nice to be here today.
That's an excerpt from my daily show called The Ezra Levant Show. Every day I do a monologue on the news of the day, and then I interview an interesting newsmaker. They could be from anywhere, really. Then I wrap up by reading my fan mail, and if I can, some hate mail too. We do it every weeknight, and my friend Sheila Gunn-Reid does a show every week too. But you've got to subscribe. Go to rebelnewsplus.com, click subscribe. It's $8 a month, and I hope you like it.